So, a physicist and a Buddhist scholar walk onto a debate stage. I know, it sounds like the setup for a joke, right? But what they actually did was tell two completely different and totally compelling stories about the nature of, well, everything. So, who's right? Let's dive in. And really, that's what this is all about. We're going to frame this whole explainer around this powerful line from the poet Muriel Rukeyser. The idea that we make sense of our world not just through equations or particles, but through the narratives we tell ourselves about what it all means. So where does this clash of ideas come from? Well, we're breaking down a fascinating 90-minute debate from Dartmouth College's Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement. This is where two absolutely brilliant minds went head-to-head on the biggest question there is. What is reality? All right, in one corner, we have Sean Carroll. He's a world-renowned theoretical physicist from Caltech, a leading voice on cosmology and quantum theory, the really big stuff. And in the other corner, Alan Wallace. His backstory is incredible. He started out as a physicist, then spent 14 years as a Buddhist monk ordained by the Dalai Lama himself, and now he's a top scholar on consciousness. So yeah, two brilliant minds coming from two profoundly different worlds. Okay, first up to the plate, the physicist's story. Let's unpack Sean Carroll's argument for what reality is really made of. Carroll kicks things off with this really elegant concept he calls layers of reality. The idea is pretty simple. We can talk about the world in many different ways, and as long as those ways are compatible with each other, they can all be true at the same time. He uses a perfect analogy to make this crystal clear, your iPhone. Think about it. On one level, you describe it by tapping an app or talking to Siri. That's a true story. But you can go a layer deeper and talk about the electronics, circuits, and wires. Also a true story. Or you could go all the way down to fundamental physics and describe it as a swarm of atoms and electrons obeying quantum field theory. Three completely different stories, all perfectly compatible, all describing the same object. So he uses this idea of layers to build a solid foundation, and then he drops the bombshell. This is where his argument takes a really fascinating and, pretty controversial turn. Here it is. Carroll puts forward what he calls the core theory. His claim is massive. For the layer of reality that includes you, me, and everything in our daily lives, the underlying laws of physics are completely known. We found all the particles, we know all the forces, the rule book for our world is finished. And if the core theory is true, the consequences are just startling. For starters, you can't bend spoons with your mind. The forces for that simply don't exist in the rule book. But much more profoundly, it means the information that makes you, your memories, your personality, is just an arrangement of atoms in your brain. So when you die, that physical arrangement breaks down. And that's it. There's nowhere for that information to go. No life after death. And to make this really tangible, Carroll puts a number on our existence, 3 billion. That's about how many heartbeats an average human gets in a lifetime. A finite number. For him, this isn't depressing. Actually, it's a liberating challenge to make every single one of those heartbeats count. And now for round two, the scholar's counterstory. Alan Wallace doesn't just offer a different perspective. He gets up and challenges the very foundation of the physicist's worldview. Now, Wallace begins by acknowledging how powerful the physicist's story is. It's consistent, it's elegant. But then he asks the key question. Is it the only one? Is it even the most fundamental story we can tell? See, Wallace argues that the physicist's story is built on a few core beliefs that are just treated as fact, but they're really unproven assumptions. Things like physicalism, the idea that only physical stuff is real, or realism, the belief that the world exists just fine without anyone looking at it. He says these aren't the proven conclusions of physics, they're the philosophical starting points. And Wallace is quick to point out that questioning these things isn't just for mystics. He brings up giants of physics, like Max Planck, the father of quantum theory, who suggested that consciousness might actually be the more fundamental thing, that mind is the matrix of all matter. I mean, this opens the door to a completely different, but still credible, scientific narrative. He illustrates this with that classic parable of the blind man and the elephant, where each man touches a different part, a leg, a tusk, a tail, and comes to a completely different conclusion about what an elephant is. Wallace suggests that physics could be just like one of those blind men, perfectly describing one part of reality while completely misunderstanding the whole animal. So this gets us to the absolute core of Wallace's argument. Modern science, he says, has a massive blind spot. It has created these unbelievably sophisticated tools for observing the external universe, but has developed basically zero rigorous methods for observing the mind from the inside out, the one thing every single one of us has direct, immediate access to. And this brings both of these powerful arguments right to a head, focusing them on a central mystery that neither story can definitively solve on its own. And this is the impasse. It's the classic mind-body problem. For Sean Carroll, the mind is simply what the brain does. It's an emergent property of matter, kind of like how wetness is an emergent property of a bunch of water molecules. But for Alan Wallace, consciousness might be the more fundamental thing, a phenomenon that our current science doesn't even have the right tools to see, let alone measure. So after this clash of intellectual titans, we're left with a question. But it's not who won. The better question is, what do we learn from the conversation itself? Ultimately, the point of all this isn't to decide if Carroll or Wallace is right. The real value here is seeing how two complete, coherent, and powerful stories can be told about the exact same reality. It's a huge reminder that any single story, whether it comes from science or spirituality, probably isn't the whole picture. Which, of course, brings us right back to our opening quote. If the universe truly is made of stories and not of atoms, then the debate between the physicist and the scholar leaves each of us with one profound and deeply personal question. Which story do you choose to live in?